On September 12, 1683, the Kahlenberg Heights shuddered as the Polish winged Hussars, apex of millennia of steppe cavalry improvement, the world's deadliest horsemen, thundered down the slope. A torrent of well-crafted steel and expertly trained horsepower crashing toward the sprawling Ottoman lines below, in the greatest cavalry charge in all of recorded history. Their infamous eagle feathers lashed to their backs, shrieked as they flew, a sound that split the evening air and turned the blood of over 100,000 Ottomans to ice. Lances lowered and level, hooves tearing the earth, they surged, heavily outnumbered yet fearlessly confident, an exceptionally well-trained, unstoppable avalanche of death, seeking to break an empire and safeguard Europe's destiny in one shattering blow. But this was no sudden storm. These noblemen turned warriors, heirs to a legacy forged across centuries by the seemingly invincible Scythians, Sarmatians, Alans, Magyar, and Cataphracts of old, carried the weight of a fading age on their winged shoulders. Unbeknownst to them, as they charged into legend, they were penning the final glorious flourish of mounted warfare, a thunderous epitaph for an unprecedented era galloping towards its end. And what an end this would prove to be. The Hussars weren't just an aesthetic spectacle, they were a terror honed to perfection. 50 years earlier, a smaller Hussar force had smashed an Ottoman host twice her size, a clash one chronicler dubbed a dress rehearsal for Vienna, where, quote, the Hussaria flew out like eagles, and the Turks scattered in terror. Now, atop the Kahlenberg, this time they faced a foe who knew their name and trembled. This was no mere rematch. It was the decisive reckoning, a moment Europe's fate teetered on the edge of a lance. And this great clash had been a long time in the making. In European history, 3 events are commonly cited as the most pivotal of turning points. After a covert Jewish and Muslim alliance threw open the gates of Toledo, and the Umayyad Caliphate powerfully swept into Western Europe, the all-important Battle of Tours represented the very moment when the pendulum began to swing in the other direction, a final stand that would turn the tide and mark the beginning of the reclamation of Europe, a victory responsible for securing the Christian dominance of the Frankish realms and shaping medieval Europe's religious and political identity. 700 years later, a similar threat, this time from the east, with the fall of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire at the hands of Ottoman conquest, shifting control of the east-west trade nexus and setting the stage for Ottoman expansion toward Europe. And now, 230 years later, as 18,000 powerful beasts readied themselves atop Kahlenberg Hill, the stage was set for the final act in the Battle of Vienna. As the Ottoman tide surged westward once more, its momentum seemingly unstoppable, setting the stage for the largest and most definitively final test. With the Ottoman Empire under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha and Sultan Mehmed IV burning with ambition to restore its prestige and power, the goal now was nothing less than taking over the heart of Europe. The Ottoman military juggernaut, now at its zenith, at the gates of a disunited Europe, dissipating her energies in brother wars, surprised and significantly outnumbered by a wealthy, organized, committed foe, the future of both powers, and in fact, the entire world geopolitical order, now hung in the balance. These were powerfully different peoples and cultures, and the coming days would help decide which of these powers and worldviews would reign as masters of Europe and represent the preeminent military and economic force in the world. Because this wasn't just a strategically important battle, this was the penultimate moment in a clash of civilizations. For generations, the Ottoman Empire had stood at the heart of the white slave trade, trafficking well over 2 million individuals between the 15th and 17th centuries alone, by raiding undefended small towns, especially across Eastern Europe, where the scale of abductions was so vast, it birthed the term Slav, to kidnap women and children, many of whom were forced into lives as concubines or in harems. This literal theft of blood and genetic capital, especially on such an industrial scale, was something largely unprecedented, and the European powers and their people had had enough. And again, much like Europe's prior battle with the Umayyad Caliphate, who were so powerfully aided and funded by Jewish allies, the Ottoman Empire of this era was also home to the largest Jewish population on Earth, a population whose merchants had played outsized roles in this trafficking and slavery. Beginning in 1492, when Ferdinand expelled the Jews to kick off Spain's famed Golden Age, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II had famously welcomed the expelled with open arms, even mocking Europe for her supposed loss. And as Emperor Leopold I once again expelled the Jews from Vienna in 1670 under accusations of disloyalty and economic exploitation, the Ottoman Empire once again became their new home, and a nexus for world Jewry. A strange figure named Sabbatai Zevi, a man whom over half the Jewish population around the world took to be their messiah, who encouraged sin and the breaking of every sacred law and tradition as a key element of his doctrine, represented perhaps the best known and most influential of these Ottoman Jews. Choosing to convert to Islam in 1666, supposedly to avoid punishment, he'd subsequently give birth to the Donmeh sect of crypto-Jews, a group similar to the early Jesuits and many Marrano Catholics of Europe. Ethnic Jews who outwardly took on the religion of their host nation for utilitarian reasons and to avoid any loss of power or wealth, but inwardly and covertly kept up their own practices. Drawing himself and his followers across the world into closer alignment with the Sultan after this conversion, wealthy merchants like the Çelebi family would subsequently provide a great deal of the funding for the Turkish military action to come, further solidifying this anti-European alliance and further joining the futures of these two peoples. In the lead up to Vienna, many throughout Europe, already harboring deep suspicions regarding the poisoning of wells during the plague, and with betrayals like Toledo weighing on their minds, believed they'd seen evidence of European Jewish merchants passing intelligence and key resources to the Ottomans, and thus tensions grew to a boiling point. The Ottoman Empire had been slowly but successfully encroaching on Habsburg territories since the 16th century. Now, taking advantage of a weakened Habsburg Empire due to uprisings by Hungarian nobles, many of whom were Calvinists and thus far friendlier to both Jewish and Ottoman forces, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa persuaded Mehmed IV to authorize a massive campaign, ostensibly to reinforce Thököly in Hungary, but covertly aimed at Vienna. Ignoring the Sultan's caution to avoid a full-scale war, he ambitiously pursued this prize largely for personal glory. By spring of 1683, an army of 100 to 150,000 Janissaries, Sipahis, Tartar auxiliaries, and artillery marched out from Maderna. These Crimean Tartars, fierce allies of the Ottomans, opportunistically swept through the countryside in merciless raids, looting villages, abducting women and children for the slave markets, and leaving behind a trail of devastation that terrorized the region. Kara Mustafa, fueled by a deep hatred for Austria, happily sanctioned these brutal raids, knowing his merchants would profit from their captives, and now set his sights exclusively on Vienna, the Habsburg capital, as the greatest prize, the quickest path to restoring Ottoman glory, crippling Christian resistance, and opening Germany to further attack. The Turks had tried and failed at Vienna's gates once before, but with valuable lessons learned, arriving earlier to avoid the winter, and with a much larger force against a much smaller, with Europe fractured and weakened, and now with significant military funding from Europe's eternal enemies, they'd see to it that this time was different. They'd also brought with them sappers and demolitions experts to effectively deal with the walls and fortifications. Confidence was high. Leopold, dealing with a depleted treasury, had been forced to leave Vienna poorly fortified. Kara Mustafa saw his opening and rushed to take it. In March of 1683, his impressively rapid advance, further swelled by both Jewish merchants' funding and French anti-Habsburg diplomatic encouragement, covering some 600 miles in 4 months, with 150,000 men and several large cannons in tow, caught the Habsburgs off guard and forced Leopold to flee Vienna for Passau on July 7th with his royal court, and with so much now riding on his ability to quickly round up Allied forces to return as soon as they could possibly muster. The Ottomans leveraged their logistical prowess and financial edge, and capitalized on their vassal state in Hungary, bolstered by Imre Thököly's rebel Calvinist forces, to secure a forward base just miles from Vienna. Beginning a massive siege July 1683, 40,000 Ottoman troops fully encircled Vienna, supported by artillery and sappers. The Europeans within Vienna, only 10,000 strong, and massively outnumbered 4-1, and soon to be 15-1, were now in the most dire circumstances. And yet, they had something of a secret weapon in their favor, and his name was Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Had Kara Mustafa known the caliber of man leading the opposition from within these walls, he'd likely have chosen a completely different course of action. Von Starhemberg, that type of stern, taciturn, disciplined figure that few recognize the greatness and necessity of until desperate times reveal it, seemed a man who'd built and oriented himself precisely for a moment like this. Having distinguished himself at the Battle of Sint-Gotthard, helping repel an Ottoman advance and earning a wound that left him with a limp and a bolstered reputation for courage, Starhemberg knew his opponent well. Tasked with fortifying the city after years of neglect, he immediately took charge and set to work, knowing his handful of men and a civilian population still reeling from a 1679 plague outbreak were now facing an Ottoman siege camp that stretched for miles. His was a defense born not of bravado, but of grim necessity, the fate of Europe now relying heavily on his ability to hold out until reinforcements, hurriedly being rallied by Leopold, might arrive. As Starhemberg was acutely aware, Vienna stood as the gateway, the last bastion before the undefended fertile plains of Austria, Bavaria, and beyond. The defensive bulwark that, if breached, put all the rest of her territory in immense and immediate danger. Should Starhemberg capitulate now, the Ottoman tide would surge unchecked into the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Kara Mustafa's vision of a Muslim empire stretching to the Atlantic might finally take root, toppling the fragile balance of Christian powers already weakened by internal strife. The cultural and religious fabric of Europe, painstakingly woven over centuries, would unravel under a new crescent banner. Cities like Prague, Munich, and even Paris might have faced the same fate as Constantinople 2 centuries prior, conquered, transformed, or reduced to vassalage. Starhemberg steeled himself and his men for a desperate fight. The city's fortifications, already outdated, were now pocked and crumbling under the barrage of Kara Mustafa's guns. Beneath the streets, Ottoman sappers tunneled like moles, planting mines that erupted in gouts of flame and stone, threatening to collapse the defenses from within. Disease and starvation gnawed the troops, while the civilian population huddled in cellars and whispered prayers amid the ceaseless roar of war. Yet Starhemberg stood firm, a figure of iron solidity and stoicism amid the chaos. His voice a steady command over the din, his presence a beacon to men who now had little left but their courage. On July 14th, Kara Mustafa formally demanded Vienna's surrender. Starhemberg defiantly refused, vowing to fight to the last drop of blood. This triggered the siege's immediate escalation. As the Turks encircled the city, Starhemberg ordered the suburbs burned to deny the enemy cover, a ruthless but brilliant move that left Vienna's walls as the sole bulwark. A contemporary Austrian chronicler wrote, "Starhemberg stood atop the ramparts, his face grim as the flames rose, shouting to his men that Vienna would not fall while a single one of them drew breath. His unshakable defiance set the tone, rallying a beleaguered garrison against an enemy that bombarded the walls with over 300 cannons, reducing entire sections of the city to rubble. 70,000 were now trapped inside, as disease, dysentery, and shelling claimed lives. The Turks played a slow, brutal game, tightening the noose while disease and hunger increasingly ravaged the trapped Viennese, who dispatched a swift plea to allies: no time to lose. His strategy was as desperate as it was brilliant. He ordered the repair of breaches under fire, marshaled every able body, soldiers, citizens, even priests, to man the ramparts, and countered Ottoman mines with daring underground raids. When food dwindled, he rationed what remained with precision and foresight. When morale faltered, he walked the walls himself, his calm defiance a bulwark against despair. For 2 full months he held the line, each day a test of endurance, each night a fresh new gamble with fate. The Ottomans, initially expecting the quick surrender of a force so massively outnumbered, found themselves bafflingly stalled by this extraordinary grit, and yet delayed a costly all-out assault, still hoping to force surrender. Though at immense cost, Starhemberg was buying precious time for a relief effort. Vienna's civilians' courage often matched the soldiers. As food ran scarce, rations fell to just a few ounces of bread and horsemeat daily. Women and children braved artillery fire to repair walls and carry water. The city's medieval walls, neglected since the 1540s, proved very vulnerable to the skilled Ottoman sappers, who effectively tunneled down to collapse fortifications. A bold group of Viennese bakers famously dug a tunnel to thwart one of these Ottoman mines, detecting the enemy's sappers by the faint sounds of picks and flooding their shaft with boiling water, a tale immortalized in Viennese lore as a triumph of common ingenuity. On August 12th, when a mine blasted a breach at the Lobel Bastion, killing dozens and opening a gap, Starhemberg personally led the counterattack, sword in hand, rallying a ragged mix of soldiers, bakers, butchers, and students to hold the line, repelling waves of janissaries in hand-to-hand combat. Chronicler Johann Peter von Walcheren wrote, "He was everywhere, a lion among men, his voice cutting through the cannon's roar." This desperate stand, repeated across multiple breaches, continued to keep the Ottomans at bay, if only just. But even as Starhemberg's lion-hearted stand held the walls, the siege ground on into August, and Vienna's fate grew bleaker with each passing day. King John III Sobieski had promised to bring a relief army by mid-August, a vow that burned as a faint hope in the hearts of the beleaguered defenders. Yet weeks dragged by, with no thunder of hooves from the Kahlenberg, and that ember of promise flickered toward ash. Within the city, the dead piled high, unburied in the sweltering heat, their rotting stench a grim shroud over streets once so alive with trade and prayer. Mid-August, von Starhemberg himself would succumb to illness, his body ravaged by exhaustion, his gaunt frame a mirror to the city's decay. His sickness struck the garrison like a blow. If their unyielding commander wavered, what hope remained? Each night, as despair deepened, the Viennese lit flares or sounded calls from St. Stephen's Tower, desperate signals flung into the dark, praying for Sobieski's relief to answer. Below ground, the war turned infernal. Ottoman sappers and Viennese counterminers clashed in a hellish labyrinth of tunnels, their battles a savage dance of steel and sweat in suffocating darkness. Each explosion a gamble, each collapse a tomb. By early September, the city's stores ran dry, and starvation sank its teeth into soldier and civilian alike, with their rations shrinking to shadows of sustenance. Of the 10,000 defenders who had stood at the siege's dawn, only 4,000 remained fit to lift a musket, their ranks thinned by death, disease, and despair. Vienna trembled on the edge of ruin, the Ottoman vice tightening. In the dark of night, messengers slipped through enemy lines, pleading for relief from the Holy League, stressing that time was now very short and must come fast and by any means necessary. On September 8th, as the Turks detonated yet another mine under the Berg bastion, killing 200 defenders, a lone trumpeter climbed the battered St. Stephen's Cathedral and blew a defiant tune, audible even to the Ottoman lines. An Ottoman chronicler noted, "The infidels cling to their city with a madness we could not fathom, as if death itself feared to claim them." Far away from the desperate siege, receiving these increasingly panicked updates, Emperor Leopold scrambled to do all in his power to cobble together allies, ultimately pinning his greatest hopes on Poland's Sobieski, a battle-hardened legend. As is so often the way with great European powers, setting aside differences to form this powerful army hadn't been the least bit easy. Leopold authored several letters in every direction, attempting to solidify the alliance. Even still, the anti-Habsburg France had refused to join. Bavaria and Saxony, still smarting from the 30 Years' War, clashed over precedence in the line of march, their envoys trading barbs and nearly blows at the negotiating table in Toulon. The Austrians sneered at the barbaric Polish cavalry, and Sobieski himself faced powerful dissent at home, with nobles nearly blocking his departure, arguing the Commonwealth's treasury couldn't spare the coin for a foreign war. And yet, this uneasy band of European brothers finally coalesced, their petty squabbles swallowed by the shadow of a greater peril. The sight of Vienna's smoke-choked spires and the distant roar of Ottoman guns silenced their rancor, forging a momentary unity. Bavaria's Max Emanuel tightened his grip on his saber, Saxony's John George rallied his musketeers, and Sobieski, contemplating the massive Turkish host now circling Vienna, saw not just a battlefield but a bulwark for Europe's soul. For all their fractures, political, personal, and parochial, these leaders and their men recognized the dire necessity of standing as one. They fought not merely for Vienna, but to safeguard Europe, her people, her culture, and her future. A shared resolve that turned a tenuous alliance into a thunderous force on the eve of history's greatest charge. And just in time, by early September, Vienna had become a shadow of itself. Walls crumbling, plague spreading, and ammunition nearly gone. Staremberg, gaunt and sleepless, still refused all surrender, even as Kara Mustafa's banners pressed ever closer. The night of September 11th, 1683, hung heavy over Vienna, its fate teetering as Ottoman minds gnawed at its last defenses, and the full force of starvation now gripped its streets. Yet atop the Kahlenberg Heights, a different scene unfolded. Flares pierced the twilight from Kahlenberg's crest, signaling the relief army's approach, sparking a surge of hope. Salvation had finally and mercifully arrived. King John Sobieski, commanding a coalition of 70,000, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, and Saxons, had finally reached the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking the city, setting the stage for the final battle. For Sobieski, the fight against the Ottomans was deeply personal, rooted in family legacy and loss. His ancestor, Stanislaw, died heroically at the Battle of Kokora in 1620, a tale of valor his mother, Sophia, instilled in him. His brother Marek was captured and executed by Tartars in 1644, and Sobieski's birth in 1629 at Olesko Castle amid Tartar raids was seen by his family as a sign of destiny. Battling Tatars and Turks became his calling. Sobieski had triumphed in a cunning counter-raid near Love in 1672 and crushed a 40,000-strong Ottoman army at the Battle of Khotin in 1673, cementing his legacy. Now, standing atop the Kahlenberg, this seasoned warrior bore not just the hopes of Europe, but a lifetime of vendetta against the Ottoman foe. As Sobieski's relief force had neared Kahlenberg, it said a young drummer boy climbed atop Vienna's shattered ramparts and began to beat a frenzied rhythm, urging an exhausted garrison to hold on. The relief army had brilliantly used the dense Vienna woods to mask their approach, avoiding Ottoman scouts, amplifying the element of surprise. However, on reaching Kahlenberg, Sobieski found the hills steeper and denser than the Habsburg maps had suggested, nearly botching his charge plan. He was forced to adapt on the fly, which he did masterfully, splitting his forces for a multi-pronged assault. Flanked by Charles of Lorraine and his German allies, they quickly finalized a daring gambit to break the siege. With far less than half the total manpower of their foes, a standard fighting force may have felt some trepidation, but these were no ordinary forces. Many gathered here represented the cream of the crop of Europe's martial elite, and King John Sobieski was certainly no ordinary commander. It's said that they were positively eager to engage, to relieve their long-besieged brothers within the walls. On the other side, the mood was very different. An eerie unease settled over the Ottoman camp below the Kahlenberg Heights. The horizon now flickered with the ominous glow of thousands of campfires, multiplying through the night like the eyes of some vast, slow-waking beast. By morning, their darkest fears stood embodied atop the ridge. Thousands of Polish winged hussars, those infamous angels of death, poised, ready to descend. Though an immense Ottoman army of well over 100,000 soldiers stretched across the valley, vastly outnumbering their foes, they found no solace in their numbers, and now braced for a reckoning. Perhaps both sides knew that within mere moments, thousands would lie dead, and the course of history would be forever changed. As the Europeans atop the hill readied themselves for the great assault, Marco di Aviano, an Italian monk sent by Pope Innocent XI, performed a hurried final mass and provided a fiery prayer to galvanize spirits in attempts to prepare the men for what lay ahead. And on the early evening of September 12, 1683, the Kahlenberg Heights bore witness to the battle's ferocious climax, as King John III Sobieski unleashed his decisive stroke. The largest cavalry charge in history. 18,000 horsemen, with 3,000 Polish winged hussars at its heart, Poland's elite shock troops. Amid the fading light, trumpets blared and Sobieski's ranks roared, the earth buckling under a relentless quake of hooves that smashed into the Ottoman lines below. Clad in leopard skin cloaks and gleaming armor, their 18-foot lances carved through flesh and steel, the hussars' feathered wings shrieking a relentless dirge as they tore Kara Mustafa's army asunder. Chronicler Jan Pasek, a Polish noble in the fray, wrote, "The ground roared as if the heavens had split, and the Turks stood agape as death rode down upon them." A hussar recalled, "We rode as one, wings roaring, lances leveled. The Turks saw us coming and their hearts failed them. We trampled their camp into the dust." Ottoman chronicler Silidar Aga captured the collapse. Quote, "Their wings sang a song of doom, and our men broke like dry reeds before a storm. Swords flashed, heads rolled, and the plain became a sea of our blood. We fled, pursued by devils." Von Starrenberg, watching from Vienna's battered walls, declared, "The glorious sight of the Polish cavalry swept down the heights. The Turks, who had tormented us for months, now scattered like leaves before the wind." End quote. At his cry, "Now, brothers, to the fight," his gaunt garrison surged from the gates, quote, cutting down the Turks as they ran, their backs to us in terror. Charles V later reflected, "The King of Poland led his horsemen down the hill with a roar that shook the earth. Their wings and lances struck such fear into the Turks that they broke before the clash was fully joined." Marco di Aviano added, "I saw with my own eyes the Polish king descend like an angel of wrath, his cavalry a storm of steel and feathers. The infidels fled as if pursued by the hosts of heaven. Sobieski himself proclaimed, 'We came, we saw, God conquered.' The enemy, struck with terror, fled in confusion, leaving behind their tents, their cannons, and all their riches. My hussars charged with such fury that the Turks could not withstand them, and the field was ours in 3 hours. Our horsemen flew as if winged by angels, and God granted us the day." End quote. The Turks abandoned all, cannons, tents, even their dead, as the hussars' blades cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Sobieski's audacity and the hussars' dominance turned a desperate stand into a decisive rout, halting the Ottoman tide at its peak. Vienna stood, not just saved, but forged into a symbol of defiance etched into history's core. And by dusk on September 12, 1683, Kara Mustafa's vision of conquest lay in ruins, his massive army in full and desperate retreat to save their lives, a devastating loss he would pay for upon returning home, with his own life strangled with a silken cord. This had been no ordinary triumph. It was the defining clash that finally and definitively destroyed the Ottoman surge. Had it not been for these winged hussars, these exceptional descendants of the Scythian and Sarmatian steppe warriors, representing the pinnacle of cavalry mastery, Europe's fate may well have mirrored Constantinople's, overrun and forever changed by Muslim swords and Jewish merchants. Their charge at Vienna was a defiant crescendo, a moment of unmatched discipline and skill that turned the tide when Europe's future wavered. More than warriors, they'd acted as guardians of a civilization, and their victory, that last brilliant echo of mounted warfare, shattered Ottoman dreams and secured a continent's destiny against overwhelming odds. We stand forever in their debt, their valor a beacon across the ages. That day atop the Kallenberg was a fulcrum of history, a stand that preserved a continent and the inheritance we hold dear, a testament to the courage and spirit of Western mankind.